Hello, everyone, and welcome to Silver Streams, the weekly podcast from the AFI Silver Theater and Cultural Center's programming team. I'm Todd Hitchcock, AFI Silver's Director of Programming.
I'm Abbie Algar, Associate Film Programmer.
And I'm Ben Delgado, the Assistant Film Programmer.
And today we're going to discuss the latest offerings in AFI Silver's virtual screening room, as well as recommending some other titles to view at home.
So new this week, we have Rams, which is an Australian reimagining of the Icelandic 2015 art house hit, Rams. We have Rock Camp the Movie, a documentary or rockumentary about rock and roll fantasy camp, where a group of people from across the US and around the world gather for a 4-day intensive course on being a rock legend. We have the documentary Some Kind of Heaven, which goes behind the scenes in America's largest retirement community, the Villages in Florida. And we have Romanian documentary, ACASță, My Home, which is returning to us from our recent AFI European Union Film Showcase. And lastly, we have Switzerland's 2020 Oscar submission, My Little Sister, starring German actress Nina Hoss.
This week, we're going to preview all of the new films premiering this week in AFI Silver's virtual screening room, recap the films that opened in previous weeks that are currently available to view there, and close with our Programmer's Picks section, where we discuss other ideas for films to watch at home. This is episode 34 of Silver Streams, and we began the podcast back in April of 2020, shortly after closing the doors to the AFI Silver Theater and launching our virtual cinema program. And we'd like to thank everyone out there who has listened to the podcast. Our most recent episodes have been especially popular, including episode 22, where we discussed Martin Scorsese's classic Goodfellas, which recently marked its 30th anniversary, or episode 25, where we discussed Alfred Hitchcock's Psycho, which was then marking its 60th anniversary, or episode 26, where we discussed two of the greatest films starring Joan Crawford and Bette Davis, that being Mildred Pierce and All About Eve. Thank you all for listening to Silver Streams, and also thanks to everyone who has been screening films at home from our virtual screening room. By screening these films at home, you are supporting AFI Silver. We receive a portion of the proceeds for every virtual cinema transaction that you make. So by screening at home this way, you are supporting our theater during our extended physical closure. So thank you all for supporting the Silver during these challenging times. And a reminder, you can find all of the titles that we are currently offering to screen at home on our website at afi.com/silver. And if you have any feedback or questions, you can always email us at silverinfo@afi.com.
You can find the podcast each Friday posted on our website at afi.com/silver, in our Friday e-blast, and across our social media channels. And we are in all the places where you usually find your podcasts.
And as I remind you every week, please be sure to subscribe to the podcast. That ensures you get the podcast as soon as we upload it into your app of choice. The podcast will pop right up if you're subscribed. And while you're in there subscribing, please be sure to rate the podcast. Give us a 5-star rating, put some comments there. And of course, tell your friends, tell your family, tell people you know, and spread the word about Silver Streams.
And as always, a really big thank you to everyone who streamed something from the virtual screening room over the weekend, and props to anyone who managed to concentrate on anything other than the news last week. I'm very pleased to report that once more, Italian filmmaker Pietro Marcello's Martin Eden was in the #1 spot last weekend. It is truly the gift that keeps on giving. And as you've heard me say a few times, this film is an adaptation of Jack London's 1909 novel. Obviously, in this case, it's set in Naples in the late 20th century. It stars Luca Marinelli in the lead role as Martin Eden, and it's really been appearing on a lot of best of 2020 lists, including Barack Obama's, by the way, and also the New York Times Manohla Dargis. In fact, she named it the best film of 2020. There's also been some Martin Scorsese comparisons in some of the reviews along the way. So it's definitely getting a lot of a lot of end of year, beginning of year buzz. And again, this is an encore presentation from our 2019 AFI European Union Film Showcase. So we've all been on board with this film for quite a while, and we're really happy that so many people are discovering it now in virtual cinemas. And another film that's been popular since we brought it back to the virtual screening room after its initial run in the summer is the documentary Coup 53, which looks at the 1953 Anglo-American coup that overthrew Iran's government and reinstalled the Shah in 1953. This film is directed by Iranian filmmaker Taghi Amirani. It's co-written and edited by Academy Award-winning editor Walter Murch. And it also features well-known British actor Ralph Fiennes. And actually, following the events of last week at the US Capitol, editor Walter Murch has cut a new trailer for the film that places footage from last Wednesday's storming of the Capitol alongside footage from the 1953 coup in Iran. And it's actually pretty chilling. You can see this new teaser trailer on the social channels for the film if you're interested in checking it out, and I'd recommend that you do, and then obviously check out the film. And we've also just added a newly recorded Q&A, which is going to play directly following the film if you watch it in our virtual screening room. That's going to be with the filmmaker, Taghi Amirani, with Ralph Fiennes and editor Walter Murch, and it's going to be moderated by Academy Award-winning documentarian Michael Moore. So definitely check that out this week.
And continuing on with more documentaries in the virtual screening room, happy to see people are checking out The Reason I Jump, a film we just opened last week and was part of the AFI Docs lineup this past summer. It's among our top performers, and it's a story of 5 nonverbal people with autism. It's told from their perspective using the words of Naoki Higashida as voiceover from his book, The Reason I Jump, the inner voice of a 13-year-old boy with autism. It's a really moving film about neurodiversity that I'm happy to see is near the top of our list. And a film we talked about being a good double feature with The Reason I Jump that also opened last week is Beautiful Something Left Behind, and that one's doing well in the virtual screening room too. It tackles grief as we follow 6 children who have recently lost one or both of their parents, and we follow their emotional journeys. Again, we have a touching and moving documentary film that takes heavy themes and shows the resilience of humanity. And speaking of human resilience, 76 Days continues to fascinate audiences in the virtual screening room. It's one of the first and most impactful accounts of a current crisis we're all still very much living through. The doc takes a look at the frontline workers in 4 hospitals in Wuhan, China, in the immediate aftermath of the COVID outbreak almost a year ago at this point.
And rounding out the top 10 or so titles currently available in our virtual screening room, we have Blizzard of Souls, the Latvian World War I epic, which has been a blockbuster release in its home country and is Latvia's submission to the Oscars Best International Film category. Also, Shadow in the Cloud, an over-the-top action-adventure genre movie starring Chloe Grace Moritz that involves supernatural intrigue on a plane in World War II, directed by Roseanne Liang. Also, the recently restored The Passionate Thief, Mario Monicelli's 1960 comedy classic, starring Anna Magnani, Toto, and Ben Gazzara. And another restored classic, Ikari XB1, the Czech sci-fi classic from 1963, based on a Stanislav Lem novel. Now, as I mentioned, beautifully restored to show off its amazing production design, and a film with an outside influence on the genre well beyond its cult underground status. If you have not yet seen it and you are interested in science fiction and specifically sci-fi, classic sci-fi films, do check this one out. I think you'll be able to detect a lot of connections with what's done in this film and what came later. Also, To the Ends of the Earth, Kiyoshi Kurosawa's latest about a Japanese TV crew's misadventures in Uzbekistan, starring Atsuko Maeda, and Citizens of the World from writer, director, and actor Johnny DiGregorio, about 3 Roman retirees making big plans to live large abroad.
And we just wrapped up our AFI European Union Film Showcase a couple of weeks ago, but we are already busy planning our next virtual festival, the 15th Capital Irish Film Festival, which will be presenting once again with our wonderful partners at Solus Nua, this year all online. It's going to be taking place March 4th to 14th. This is always a really popular program in person, and we're very excited to try and capture that excitement and interest in the virtual space too. We already have some really interesting titles lined up, and I think it's going to be a very good year. And just as we do in person, we're also looking forward to having some really fascinating conversations with Irish filmmakers and actors and artists. And this year you can watch all of this from the comfort of your home, Guinness or whiskey in hand or other drink of choice. The passes for the festival are on sale now. They're just $100 for access to everything in the lineup. And that lineup will be announced on Tuesday, February 9th. So keep an eye out for that very soon.
And if you haven't already taken a dive into the sumptuous world of Wong Kar-wai, our virtual series continues on in the screening room with 9 features from the brilliant Hong Kong auteur. I won't go down the full list here, but a few highlights include restorations of Chungking Express, Happy Together, In the Mood for Love, and for the first time ever, the expanded version of The Hand. All of these courtesy of Janus Films. And we also have a couple of titles from Sony Pictures Classics in this series, Ashes of Time Redux and 2046. And you can see the full list of the films on our website, where you can also pick up a pass to catch all 9 films. And of course, you can pick and choose if you want to just watch 1, 2, 3 films. I suggest checking out any of them because they're all great. Wong Kar-wai is an amazing director. So yeah, we still have that series going, and we hope people check it out. And I know some of you already have.
And just announced this week is our next online silent film presentation, which is The Phantom Carriage, with live musical accompaniment by Andrew Simpson. And that will take place on Thursday, January 28th at 8 p.m. Eastern Time. And it will be available to anyone online in the United States and United States territories. And the event technically does not have a price. It is a pay what you can event, like the last several times we did presented silent films online. The Phantom Carriage is Victor Holström's 1921 masterpiece, a supernatural drama about death, personified as the Grim Reaper, recruiting a new soul to take over the job on New Year's Eve. And this film is marking its 100th anniversary this year, actually this month. It was released 100 years ago in January of 1921. And filmmaker Holström also stars in the film, as he would do many years later as a much older man in 1957, acting for Ingmar Bergman in Wild Strawberries. If you think back to Wild Strawberries and the older gentleman, retired academic, that is Victor Holström. And by far the best known film he's associated with. But Holström was a major figure during the silent era as a writer, director, and actor. First in Sweden, but also spending several years in Hollywood, where as Victor Seaström was the slightly adjusted name he used for his Hollywood film credits. He was a director on such silent era classics as He Who Gets Slapped, The Scarlet Letter with Lillian Gish, and also again with Lillian Gish in The Wind. And providing musical accompaniment for this presentation of The Phantom Carriage will be our good friend Andrew Simpson. Andrew is a local here in the DC area and has performed for silent film screenings for us at the AFI Silver in person many, many times over the years. He may well be the person who's performed the most for silent films at the Silver. And just recently, he played for us for our presentation in late October of Nosferatu. So those of you who watched that presentation online know what Andrew sounds like, and we know he's going to do something amazing again with his score for The Phantom Carriage this time out. So once again, that's The Phantom Carriage on Thursday, January 28th at 8 p.m. Eastern Time, featuring live musical accompaniment by Andrew Simpson. And as with our past silent events online, you'll pre-register on our website in order to have access to the live stream that will be taking place Thursday, January 28th at 8 p.m. So please mark your calendars for that one. Okay, so that's what's coming up for special events. And here are the new films debuting in the virtual screening room this week.
So first up is Rams, which is coming to us from Samuel Goldwyn Films, who are also bringing us Agnieszka Holland's Spore and Thomas Vinterberg's Another Round at the moment, by the way. So they have a really good slate this year. And Rams is an Australian reimagining of Icelandic filmmaker Grímur Hákonarsson's beloved 2015 hit Rams, about two estranged brothers raising separate flocks of sheep on the same plot of land in rural Iceland. And if you enjoyed that excellent film, which, by the way, won Best Film in the Uncertain Regard section of Cannes in 2015, then I think you're going to really like this Australian adaptation, which is certainly a very different film, obviously, but I would say tonally does retain quite a lot from the Icelandic version. So this retelling of the tale comes from Australian director and actor Jeremy Sims, known most recently for his 2015 road trip dramedy, Last Cab to Darwin, which won several awards at the Australian Academy Awards that year and stars Michael Caton, who also appears here in Rams. And in this adaptation, the action moves from rural Iceland to remote Western Australia, so a slightly different climate, but there are also sheep there. And this is where sheep farming brothers Colin, played by beloved New Zealand actor Sam Neill, and Les, played by Australian actor Michael Caton, as I mentioned, are locked in a decades-long feud. And despite living in adjacent houses on the same patch of inherited family land, are not on speaking terms and are fiercely competitive about their sheep farming skills. They're each raising separate flocks of rare Dorset horn sheep descended from their family's prized bloodline. And they're working literally side by side while barely acknowledging one another's existence. Colin, Sam Neill, is the more affable, sociable, sensible of the two, while Les, Michael Caton, is the exact opposite. He's a pretty grumpy loner with no patience for other people and what appears to be quite a serious drinking problem. And so everything changes when Les's prize-winning ram is diagnosed with a rare and highly contagious disease by a visiting vet from the UK, Cat, played by British actress Miranda Richardson. She happens to be an expert on Dorset horn sheep because she hails from Dorset in the UK, which is also where I'm from. And I know nothing about these type of sheep, by the way. A little bit more now I've seen this film. And then following this diagnosis, the authorities order a purge of every sheep in this close-knit valley, including the neighboring farms, which means that in addition to these brothers losing their livelihood, the potential end of this bloodline of this rare breed of Dorset horn sheep. And they both fear that they're going to be relegated to raising the far more common merino sheep, which they both hold very much in contempt. So while Colin attempts in various ways that I won't reveal to outwit the authorities, Les opts for defiance. He's day drinking. He's letting his pretty messy lifestyle get completely out of control. But of course, it will take them coming together in some way to save their herds and keep the family tradition and the community going. And I won't reveal how they do that, but it's fun. So I mentioned that if you like the Icelandic version of this film, you'll also enjoy this. And that's because, well, yes, they're very different. I do think this film retains some of the kind of weird, dark comedy and the mixture of laughter and sadness that makes the original film so good. And to describe this film and to see some of the promotional materials for this Australian version, including the logline for the Australian release, "Where there's a wool, there's a way," you might expect this to be a pretty gimmicky, broad comedy, which is actually not what you get here at all. Yes, there is absolutely comedy, and it's fun, but the characters in this film and their situation do feel quite real and lived in, and it's similar in that way to the Icelandic version. And yes, this is a comedy about warring brothers and their sheep, but it's also an interesting and touching look at loneliness and masculinity and family ties and small town life that will strike a chord. And I think tonally, in a way, it actually resembles Thomas Vinterberg's Another Round a little bit. So there's a double feature for you right there. Oh, and by the way, if you saw the Icelandic version and you enjoyed the amazing woolen sweaters that the brothers wear in that film, you'll be pleased to know that the two central brothers in this film also sport some very attractive knitwear. And just as you get to see some of the lovely Icelandic wilderness in the original Rams. Here you get to see a lot of eye-catching scenery of Western Australia. The cinematography is very nice. You get some sweeping aerial shots that I think were probably done by a drone and definitely make me want to go on holiday there. There's also a great cast, as I mentioned, and Sam Neill is basically made for this role. It's definitely a little bit similar to his recent role as a grumpy old man in Taika Waititi's Hunt for the Wilder People. And of course, Sam Neill in real life lives on a vineyard and a farm in New Zealand. And you can learn all about that on his Twitter account, where he posts lots of lovely vistas and wine and farm animals. So I think this film is probably very close to his heart, and you can tell in the performance. So if you're looking for a serious-minded, grown-up dark comedy that retains flashes of its Icelandic roots, but puts a quite uniquely Australian spin on things, or if you're a fan of rural or agrarian dramedies and thrillers and sheep herding on film, which we all are on the pod, then don't be sheepish about giving this film a try.
So Abbie, I know that all three of us are a little bit apprehensive when we come across a remake of a film, typically from one country to another country, that we really appreciated in its original form, and we're leery about how it's going to translate into this remake just a few years later. Now in another country, perhaps. With better established stars. But all reports from you and from others is that everything works pretty well in the transposition here, which comes as a relief. All three of us are huge fans of the original Icelandic film. And then Sam Neill, I've sort of fluctuated on my opinion of Sam Neill sort of project to project, but recently you mentioned Hunt for the Wilder People, Taika Waititi's movie. I loved him in that movie. So if this is something of a continuation, then sign me up for that.
Yeah, definitely is. And yeah, we do often groan when we hear about an English language remake coming of any film that we've seen and enjoyed in a non-English language. So, I was a bit worried, I will admit, but this definitely manages to pull it off. Okay, so that is Rams, coming to us from Samuel Goldwyn Films.
Okay, so next up in the virtual screening room this week is the documentary Rock Camp, the Movie. Do you love rock and roll? Do you wish to hone your craft learning from veteran rockers and harbor dreams of rocking out on stage alongside them? If so, then Dave Fishoff's Fantasy Rock Camp may be for you. And Rock Camp, the Movie, shows you what takes place during the week-long adult fantasy camp that many upper-middle-class rock fans pay hefty fees to attend, and by the looks of it, enjoy every minute of. While the documentary's trailer and marketing materials understandably promote the appearances by the likes of Alice Cooper, Roger Daltrey, Sammy Hagar, Gene Simmons and Paul Stanley of Kiss, Heart's Nancy Wilson, Slash of Guns N' Roses fame, Joe Perry from Aerosmith, Jeff Beck, Rob Halford of Judas Priest, Jerry Cantrell of Alice in Chains, Lita Ford, formerly of the Runaways and a solo artist, Meatloaf, and Warren Haynes of Government Mule and the Allman Brothers Band. I found the camp's founder, Dave Fishoff, to be a fascinating character in his own right. Fishoff grew up the son of a synagogue's cantor and was a music lover, but not really a musician himself. And he started off professionally in showbiz, booking nightclub acts in the Catskills at various resorts. From there, he branched out into managing various musicians, but then he was inspired, as he tells it, by witnessing the excitement at a personal appearance by Dr. J, Julius Erving, the great NBA star of the 70s and early 80s, at which point Fishoff was inspired to make the leap from music promotion and representation to sports representation and became a sports agent through the 70s and 80s. And during this time, he was the agent for, among other professional athletes, Phil Simms, the star quarterback of the New York Giants at the time, Mark Bavaro, another Giant great, Vince Ferragamo, and baseball's Lou Piniella, among others. But in the 80s, Fishoff pivoted back to his first love, music, and correctly reading where the audience was demographically, had a tremendous success organizing the reunion tour of the 60s television band The Monkees in 1985. And then again, a few years later, he was instrumental in pulling together and launching the first installment of Ringo Starr's All-Star Band, which kicked off with a 1989 tour, which then recurred practically every year for the next several decades. In the late 90s, Fischoff got the idea to put together the Rock and Roll Fantasy Camp. And to hear him tell it, the early years were not so well attended and in fact lost money. But a combination of good press coverage and key pop cultural placements, including various news magazines, The Howard Stern Show, an episode of Ellen DeGeneres' sitcom Ellen that has Ellen signing up to attend Rock and Roll Fantasy Camp, an excellent episode of The Simpsons, an excerpt of which is featured in the film's trailer, and a very clever Citibank credit card ad that some of you may recall. It was in heavy rotation for a while time. And Fischoff credits that awareness from those kind of pop cultural references and key press placements really helping to spread awareness about his fledgling venture, and eventually it started to take off following that. So for me, Fischoff's relatively candid insights and anecdotes about the business side of it, of his various undertakings in show business, which now include the Rock and Roll Fantasy Camp, were really interesting to hear. And Fischoff's story is intercut alongside the stories of several highly satisfied customers, some of whom are returnees to Rock and Roll Fantasy Camp, including a woman from New Jersey who works in New York City as an accountant and is a senior vice president at her company, and a huge Kiss fan with a suburban basement rec room tricked out with all sorts of Kiss memorabilia and her drum kit. She has formerly attended rock camp as a drummer and is now returning for the first time as a vocalist, or a man from California who's a senior exec at McKinsey, but a lifelong metalhead, and a variety of other well-established professionals who still in their free time enjoy rocking out. Also, two pairs of fathers and sons where the love of music is a key bonding area for them and the family. In one case, a son who was diagnosed with autism early on, but who has since come a long way, and guitar playing and his love of music is a big part of that. And another with a son who suffered significant brain damage at birth. And again, for whom the love and enjoyment of music is a big part of what father and son and the family rally around. And we also get a few glimpses of some of the musicians who work at the camp as counselors. Many of the bigger names seem to come in for sort of focused appearances, but there's also several who work during the course of the week as counselors, and they're tasked with putting the campers through their paces to form pickup bands for purposes of the week, culminating in the eventual big performance, and watching the starting off points of the bands of the various attendees getting to know each other and get started on what their band's going to be, selecting their name, selecting what they're going to perform is fun to see. So perhaps not surprisingly, most of the camp counselors are veteran sidemen, or their CVs include time logged in the later non-original lineups of established bands, or perhaps their original band's fame was ultimately quite short and is long gone by this time. But I found some of these folks quite interesting, including bassist Tony Franklin, who you may not know by name, but you might possibly recognize him by face, and you certainly would recognize some of the various musicians and bands that he played with over the years, including, well, a wide variety. He played in bands supporting Roy Harper and Kate Bush, but more often played in harder rock bands such as Whitesnake, and was most prominent in the mid-'80s during his time in the rock supergroup The Firm, along with Led Zeppelin's Jimmy Page and Bad Company's Paul Rodgers. And Franklin is quite candid about the too fast, too soon lifestyle during those years, ultimately just grinding him down, leaving him feeling kind of empty, and seems to be leading a much quieter, more balanced life now, and is happy for it, but absolutely enjoys his role taking part in the rock camp, and I think gets something out of passing along musicianship to others. And yeah, he's one of the more likable characters we meet along the way in this documentary. I was also really taken by another bassist, as it turns out, Rudy Sarzo, who another one you might recognize him by face. Certainly, if you remember 80s era MTV, he was the bassist originally in Quiet Riot, later played for Ozzy Osbourne, and again, Whitesnake. This is kind of like a Spinal Tap theme here of musicians logging time playing for Whitesnake. And Sarzo has a quote in the documentary that I absolutely love. It goes something like this: "I can completely understand why anybody who's never been to rock and roll fantasy camp would be apprehensive about coming, because I was, but I walk into the room and I'm going like, wow, this sounds awful, but look at the fun everyone is having." And Sarzo goes on to later credit working with campers, really helping him to rediscover his joy in making music. So this documentary, directed by Renee Barron and Douglas Blush, is about as far away from the documentary stylings of a Frederick Wiseman or an Errol Morris as you can get, but it is absolutely an entertaining diversion. Absolutely. So if rock camp sounds like it might be something you would enjoy having a look at, or maybe even one day attending, consider checking out Rock Camp the movie this week.
Well, I'm certainly looking forward to this, and then to the Christopher Guest's mockumentary version of this documentary. It does sound fun.
Yeah, well, right. Christopher Guest. So the whole Spinal Tap thing. There were moments when I was watching this that Spinal Tap was leaping to mind. Absolutely. And in a way, he already got there with Spinal Tap. But yeah, in the best possible way, it will perhaps make you think of Spinal Tap more than once while you're watching it. And then, of course, Spinal Tap forms a great double feature with just about anything you could combine it with. So if that's where your inclination lies, go ahead, double down. Okay, so once again, that's Rock Camp the movie, and that's coming to us from M. Tuckman Media.
So next up in the virtual screening room, we have a very different documentary from what we just discussed. It's Some Kind of Heaven, the directorial debut from documentarian Lance Oppenheim. The film had its world premiere at the 2020 Sundance Film Festival and went on to play the Rotterdam Film Festival, True False, and the MoMA Doc Fortnight. It was the closing night film in that festival. The documentary explores life inside of manicured lawns and meticulously crafted suburban bliss that's offered up by The Villages, the self-described Disney World for retirees, which itself is about an hour drive from Disney World, so pretty close to the actual theme park. Here, every day is supposed to be a good one for the 120,000 plus senior citizens in the 32-mile radius of The Villages. Whether you're interested in synchronized swimming or cheerleading, Tai Chi, or golf cart parades, this large community of healthy retirees offers a utopian vision of a bygone era of an American dream with wide streets, picture-perfect landscapes, and countless activities, all in service of their residents' golden years. While most of the residents have bought into the community's blissful optimism, we do meet a small group, a married couple, a widow, and a bachelor, all living on the margins of the marketing fantasy that was created by The Villages, who are struggling to find their footing in this manufactured dream world, the waiting room for heaven, as one of the residents calls it. For Anne and Reggie Kinser, who have been married for 47 years, the difficulties that come with maintaining any long-term relationship are really starting to come to a head. Anne is at home at The Villages, but the wide variety of wholesome activities aren't really enough for Reggie. And as he experiments with drugs in search of a spiritual breakthrough, tensions build between the couple. Eventually, he has to face the music when he's arrested for cocaine possession. This, of course, pushes the couple to the edge as Reggie grows increasingly unmoored from reality, and Anne has to wrestle with the tough decision of continuing their marriage or ending a relationship of nearly 50 years. Barbara Locchiato never planned to live in The Villages. She's a transplant who moved there 12 years ago with her late husband. Following his death, she's had to find full-time employment at The Villages. And it's now been 4 months since his passing in the documentary, and we see that she's struggling both financially and emotionally. And acting classes do provide an outlet for her feelings, but The Villages dating scene is really more intimidating than inviting. That is, until she meets a margarita enthusiast, Lynn Henry, a golf cart salesman and rabbit parrot head. That's Jimmy Buffett fan for those not in the know, who invites her into his really lively social life. And he's kind of a man about town in The Villages. And then there's Dennis Dean. Once a handyman to the stars, He's floated through one relationship after another for his entire life. And this is the one subject of the documentary who isn't technically living in the villages. He's actually living in a van while avoiding officials from the villages. And he's determined to find a relationship that will finally allow him financial stability. But finding a wealthier woman willing to take him in, whether at the pool or the church, proves difficult. And when an old girlfriend unexpectedly invites him to stay with her, Dennis finds his desire for comfort struggling against his desire for independence. Told together, their stories gently prick at the village's consumerist promise and underscore how decamping in a fantasy land like the villages can't actually keep life's obstacles at a distance. Despite the villages making headlines as of late with its over 95% white and 2-to-1 Republican demographics, the film keeps its focus on the personal stories of this small group and leaves political discussions completely off the table. And that works for this story. Maybe there's another one yet to be told about those demographic breakdowns and the golf cart caravans that go along with it. But either way, this very personal film serves as a critique of the suburban American dream that is clearly fading as those from the generation where it was born enter their twilight years.
Well, first of all, I didn't know that Jimmy Buffett fans were called parrot heads, Ben. So I've already learned something before even watching the film. So thanks. And then 2, just reading about this film and seeing the stills, I kept thinking of Seinfeld and the retirement community where Jerry Seinfeld's parents live in Florida. And I'm sure that's probably the image lots of people have in their heads when they think of the villages, especially people who aren't from America. And of course, this film gives a much more nuanced and complete portrait of some of the people who live there, it sounds like. So definitely valuable on that level.
Yeah, I think on the surface, what the villages seems to be, Seinfeld is a good point of comparison with the parents there, and that suburban nature and that polish and sheen that even they're trying to really sell as the appeal for the villages. This kind of goes beyond that for sure, and it's a really personal story for these people, but it is a critique of the villages in and of itself. And in this whole mentality that they have. So yeah, a pretty interesting look at what retirement communities are in this country specifically. I think, at least reflecting on the film, I feel like it's a pretty American phenomenon, this kind of retirement community, maybe because it's so based in consumerism and capitalism, but it really does feel that way, like a really American kind of thing. So that's Some Kind of Heaven from our friends at Magnolia Pictures.
Well, next up in the virtual screening room is another documentary, another very different documentary, this time ACASØ, My Home, which is coming to us from Zeitgeist Films. And as I mentioned earlier on the podcast, this is another film returning from our AFI European Union Film Showcase. This was our Romanian selection last year, and it had its world premiere almost exactly a year ago, actually, at the 2020 Sundance Film Festival, where it went on to win the Special Jury Award for Cinematography in the World Cinema Documentary section, before going on to screen at festivals across the world, virtually for the most part, and to also pick up a slew of awards, including Best Documentary at the Krakow Film Festival, the Human Rights Award for Documentary at the Sarajevo Film Festival, and a special mention for International Documentary Film at the Zurich Film Festival. The film is directed by investigative journalist turned filmmaker Radu Cianuciuc, and it takes place for the most part on the outskirts of Bucharest in an overgrown natural park, which is located on an abandoned water reservoir just outside of the metropolis. And it's here that we meet the Anake family, 9 children and their parents. They're a Roma family who have lived on this abandoned patch of land off the grid and embedded in nature for 2 decades. They sleep in a hut on the lakeshore. They forage, fish, and trap for food, and they basically follow the rhythm of the seasons. And in the opening scenes of the film, the family's life really does seem pretty idyllic as we see the kids fishing and swimming during the warm summer days, seemingly without any care in the world. And of course, the reality of the family's life is far more complex than this, and the documentary explores this. It's shot over nearly 4 years during a period that would be transformative for the Anakes, as the Romanian government decides that the land on which they live should be reclaimed as a public national park. In fact, what will become the largest urban nature park in the European Union. And so once this plan gets the official stamp of approval, the authorities begin the process of kind of preparing and cleaning up the park. And that includes removing the Anake family from their home, essentially evicting them with the help of social services and the police and forcing them to move into a small apartment in urban Bucharest. And so Ciunuciuc, having embedded himself within the family, records this transition from the life they know and actually prefer on the outskirts of society, but in nature, to a life in the city where the children will be going to school for the first time, where they're going to have to deal with the constraints of living in a small inner city apartment, going to the supermarket, dealing with some hostile neighbors, navigating public transportation, all the trappings that they had really aimed to avoid by living as they had in this park. And we see in the film as the 9 children, who range in age, by the way, from about a year old to 18 years old, and their parents struggle in various ways to conform to this new way of living and to maintain their connection to one another throughout. And there aren't really any easy answers about which lifestyle is ultimately, quote unquote, better for the family. But I will say that their new life in the city is far from ideal. And you can't help but feel that even now, existing within this system, they are still kind of pushed to the fringes of society. And Ciunuciuc really has an empathetic and cinematic eye, and he uses the family's dilemma to kind of explore questions about the value of conformity, the pleasures and the challenges of the natural world versus the comforts and the distractions of the modern world. And the essential question is, what constitutes a good life? And of course, there isn't an easy answer to that, and the film doesn't strive to provide it. And the film certainly deserved the Special Jury Award for cinematography that it received at Sundance last year. It's very beautiful to look at. It's very immersive. And ultimately, it gives the audience a very fascinating and judgment-free look at the inner workings of this unconventional family. And while it is a very specifically Romanian story, there is something universal about it. I can imagine that there are similar stories here in the US and, of course, across the world. And I think Ciunuciuc's experience as an investigative journalist has really served him well in getting to this story, which, as I mentioned, is probably not as uncommon a story as you might think, but it's certainly not very often explored in cinema. And by the way, this is definitely a great opportunity to do a double feature with the other Romanian documentary in our virtual screening room. In fact, Romania's Oscar submission this year, Collective. So I would do both.
And it sounds like you could maybe even do a quadruple feature with those two, and Leave No Trace and Captain Fantastic, these narrative films of similar situations.
Yeah, and even something like Chloe Zhao's Nomadland, which is getting a lot of Oscar buzz at the moment, I think is an interesting comparison. Definitely stories that we don't see typically in film, but maybe coming more and more to the fore. Okay, so that is ACASØ, My Home, coming to us from Zeitgeist Films.
So the 5th of 5 films we have opening in our virtual screening room this week, the Swiss film My Little Sister, or Schwesterlein, written and directed by the team of Stéphanie Chouat and Véronique Raymond. And this is a very well acted family drama that concerns 2 siblings. One, the playwright Lisa Braunschweig, played by Nina Haas. And Haas is one of the best actors working in German language cinema today. She was most recently seen in the film The Audition, which we featured in the virtual screening room. And she's probably best known for her films Barbara, Phoenix, and Yella, all made with the writer-director Christian Petzold, whose films we have featured many times over the years, including most recently Undina in the most recent edition of the European Union Film Showcase. And Haas also can be seen in the still kind of recent John le Carré adaptation, A Most Wanted Man, directed by Anton Corbijn. And the other sibling in the relationship, they're fraternal twins actually, is Lisa's brother Sven Braunschweig, played by the actor Lars Eidinger. And Eidinger is probably best known at the moment for the German language series Babylon Berlin, which has been a pretty big hit, not only in Germany, but internationally. And he also had parts in Olivier Assayas's Cloud of Sils Maria, and very recently Claire Denis' sci-fi film High Life. At the opening of the film, we see Sven moving into his mother's apartment, overseen by his sister Lisa, following his recent diagnosis of leukemia and bone marrow transfusion from his sister. And from there, we learn a bit more about current affairs in everyone's lives, including that Sven is due to play Hamlet in a production with a director he's had a long collaboration with. We learn that Lisa hasn't written anything in quite a while, and that her career is in fact somewhat on hold while she's temporarily relocated to Basel, Switzerland for her husband Martins, played by the Danish actor Jens Albinus. Martin's job is a principal at an exclusive boarding school there. And I'll just mention that Albinus recently starred opposite Haas in the audition as well. And we also meet Lisa and Sven's mother, Kathy, played by Marta Keller. And Kathy's seen to be opinionated, flighty, very unorganized, and perhaps something of a drunk and pill popper. And maybe not a conventionally loving mother either, to put it mildly. And from here, the family dynamics rub against each other and cause increasing degrees of friction. Lisa is devoted to caring for Sven, but perhaps ignoring other aspects of her life. Sven wavers between ignoring his condition and fixating on it, perhaps focusing too much on his hopes to hold on to his intended role of playing Hamlet, which he's just not healthy enough to take on in his current condition. Martin trying to balance his work life and the offer to move long-term to Switzerland versus his wife's desire to return to Berlin. And Sven and Lisa's mother, Kathy's general uselessness as a caregiver or provider of emotional support. She seems to be most adept at reminding her children of their shortcomings and measuring their work against past masters, including that of their late father. I think for anyone who has experienced terminal disease within a family unit and the duty to care for one's loved ones under those conditions, including one that includes a certain level of everyday family dysfunction, this scenario will resonate poignantly. But I also think that the film has a second level of resonance in the relationship between Lisa and Sven. On the one hand, it's about two intensely close twins, but this could also be read as some kind of exploration of duality. One is the brother, one is the sister, one is a writer, one is a performer. And in some ways, I think there's a hint of a suggestion that they're like a single cleft personality. But none of this would work without excellent acting, and the cast, led by the intense presence of Nina Haas, delivers on that front in a big way. The film has had a very nice festival run, beginning with Berlin last winter, and is now Switzerland's submission for the Oscars Best International Film category. So please consider checking out My Little Sister, debuting this week in our virtual screening room.
I'm definitely a fan of Nina Haas, especially her work with Christian Petzold, which you mentioned. So I'm definitely excited to see this one.
Yeah, I think she's one of those performers. Depending on what your own personal tastes are, but Isabelle Huppert would be another one for me, where I'm pretty much interested in whatever they do next to check out. So on the strength of her performance alone, I highly recommend checking out the film. Yeah, I really do think she's one of the top actors out there, and she's really good here in this film. Okay, so once again, that's My Little Sister, and that is coming to us from Film Movement. All right, so that's what's new this week in AFI Silver's virtual screening room. In addition to discussing the films we have available as virtual cinema, each week we also like to discuss some other ideas for films that you can view at home, this being our Programmer's Picks section. And this week, as we head into MLK Day weekend, with Monday, January 18 being Martin Luther King Jr. Day, and with the new film, the new documentary, MLK FBI, from filmmaker Sam Pollard, opening this Friday, the same day, the same Friday that we're dropping the new episode of the podcast, we've chosen to discuss the many excellent feature films, both narratives and documentaries, that have been made about Martin Luther King Jr., many of which have only been made recently in the past decade or so, including the latest film on the topic of MLK, again, coming out this Friday, January the 15th, which is MLK FBI, again, from filmmaker Sam Pollard. While pretty much every King bio, be it narrative or documentary, addresses the fact that King was surveilled extensively by J. Edgar Hoover's FBI, allegedly for ties to communism, but as is gone into in great depth in Pollard's documentary and in pretty much every, at least partially, in pretty much every past biography of King, that was really just a pretense to invade the man's privacy for political ends that perhaps Hoover could not even completely define to himself. It really did seem to turn into kind of a surveillance for surveillance sake over the years and years that it took place. So again, while every biography covers this, references this, it's such an extensive act of surveillance on the part of the state that I think Pollard has done a great thing by giving it its due separately in a single documentary dedicated to that aspect of King's biography. And the film combines well-chosen archival footage with interviews from a number of civil rights leaders from the time and knowledgeable academics that help us better understand the severity of the issue, where and when it crossed the line into unlawfulness, and the very ugly politics of personal destruction that it was predicated on. And again, to Pollard's credit, he really privileges the image. We don't get talking head interviews in the approach here. He wanted to really hold that focus on the visual, so it's done in voiceover. And this is a device Pollard very particularly gives credit to the recent documentary, The Black Power Mixtape, for making him see how that approach could have a very effective aspect to it, and really keeping the focus on the archival visual element, as opposed to the more conventional cross-cutting and direct-to-camera address from the interview subject. So that's used to really winning effect here in Pollard's latest film.
This is definitely one of my favorite films in the virtual Toronto Film Festival last year. Firstly, because as you mentioned, I really like the way it's constructed, almost entirely from archival footage and film clips from Hollywood films that represent the FBI in various ways, archival audio recordings and new interviews that you mentioned that are overlaid in voiceover rather than presented on screen as talking heads. And there are some very high profile interviewees here, including former FBI Director James Comey, for example. So it's a bold decision to actually not show these interviewees on camera, but it really, really works. And then secondly, this film really covers an essential and much lesser known chapter in Martin Luther King's story, and one that's really incredibly relevant right now. And I don't mean the chapter in which King had extramarital affairs. And while it's not in any way salacious, this film, it doesn't really refute that behavior. He was a complex person, as we all are. The chapter I mean, and what's really revelatory about this film is this story, as Todd mentioned, of how the information was gathered by the FBI obsessively and unlawfully in some cases, and then weaponized basically to blackmail and discredit and otherwise disempower King during the height of the civil rights movement. It's really a story of this all-out hands-on-deck surveillance operation. And, that's the level of threat that the white establishment saw in Martin Luther King. They treated him basically as an enemy of the state. And this is a man who represented the very idea of nonviolent resistance. So Just looking back to events of this past week, the contrast between this intense level of surveillance and scrutiny by the FBI and then what we saw leading up to and in the aftermath of the violent insurrection at the Capitol last Wednesday, for example, and the response to it, or the lack of response to it by authorities. I mean, it's pretty stark. And actually, I was thinking I should really rewatch this film in light of more recent events. And obviously, Sam Pollard is a very highly skilled and talented documentarian. He's really at the height of his powers with this film, I think. He's an Emmy-winning, Academy Award-nominated editor, producer, director, and he's been among cinema's most dedicated chroniclers of the Black experience in the US for, I think, over 4 decades. He's moved with ease between film and long-form TV, between narrative and documentary. His first assignment as a documentary producer came in 1989 for the PBS series Eyes on the Prize, which chronicled the civil rights movement up to that moment. And then between 1990 and 2000, Pollard edited several of Spike Lee's films, including Mo Better Blues, Jungle Fever, Bamboozled. And he also produced several documentaries with Spike Lee for film and television, including Lee's 1997 film, Four Little Girls, about the 1963 Birmingham church bombings. And that film went on to be nominated for Best Documentary Feature in 1998. And so from his collaborations with other filmmakers to his own documentaries as director, Pollard's works really explore complicated American figures and American histories with urgency and with a journalistic kind of thoroughness. As a director, he's had a number of high-profile titles recently, including the 2016 documentary, Two Trains Running, the 2017 film, Sammy Davis Jr., I've Got to Be Me, which I know Todd's a big fan of, 2018's Maynard. And he was also a co-director with Melissa Hayslip on Mr. Soul, which was in our virtual screening room very recently. And he's also directed, as I mentioned, a lot for television, including several PBS American Masters episodes. Most recently, August Wilson, The Ground on Which I Stand, a really excellent portrait of August Wilson. And you can actually see that one right now, January 15th to 22nd, free as part of Film at Lincoln Center's virtual Sam Pollard retrospective, which they're mounting to mark the release of MLK FBI. And I think Pollard is also at work on his next film, which is called Counting the Ballots. And so from the title alone, I can only imagine that that's going to be just as topical as MLK FBI.
Yeah, I'm sure it will be quite topical. And unfortunately, as you mentioned, MLK FBI, although these things are what we're seeing here from this recently declassified footage is stuff that happened decades ago. We're still kind of dealing with similar issues and treating two different classes of people in two different ways, two different worlds that they live in. So it's kind of stark to see that, as you mentioned. And I'll echo my love for the film itself, for MLK FBI. I thought it was among the best at Toronto as well in the virtual festival. And as you mentioned, Pollard is really an accomplished filmmaker in a lot of different ways. From editing, one that you didn't touch on, I'll just give a quick shout out to Style Wars from 1983, which is a really good movie that I've seen a few times about the hip hop in the early 80s, specifically graffiti and breaking in New York City. And it's a really great documentary if you haven't seen that one. So I recommend that. And of course, this film. And yeah, I think the declassified documents, just to go back to that a little bit more, is giving validity to something we've heard a lot about King and the way he was surveilled by Hoover and the FBI. So I guess there's a little bit of a relief in being able to point to these specific factual pieces here in the film that are now available to us. But as we'll hear with some of the other films, this is a thing that came up a lot, and now we know it really did happen, even though we knew it really did happen before this.
Yeah, and again, I think the aspect of this that's really hard to understand beyond someone just relaying to you this happened is the immense scale of it, and for how long it went on, and just volumes and great volumes of paperwork, just creating this entire archive, and for what reason? Like none that makes any sense. But there's just this kind of mania to invade a public figure's life, expecting to dig up something. And well, it's a pretty sad chapter in terms of what the FBI was doing to King and by extension to the movement at the time. And I think giving it again, Pollard here giving full attention to this dark chapter is the best way to get a proper sense of the scale of it, and how it relates to other aspects of King's work and life. And then, Ben, I'm glad you went and mentioned Style Wars. That also is a film that Sam Pollard was connected to. Even though you might not recognize his name or maybe not until recently, he's one of those filmmakers who's been around for a long time, wearing different hats on different projects. So the good news, if you're only just now hearing this name, Sam Pollard, when you look up his filmography on IMDb, you realize that there's a lot of projects that he was involved in, whether as a director, producer, or editing another director's work, and a lot worth checking out. And as Abbie mentioned, yes, I'm a huge fan of his Sammy Davis Jr. documentary. There's tons of great information in that one as well. So a moment ago, I mentioned that there's been a lot of recent documentaries made about MLK just in the last 10 years or so. And it's interesting when you go to IMDb and look up the many, many films and documentaries that have been made over the time, or a lot of films that that are on 60s history, 50s, 60s history, and maybe bring in King at some point as a chapter or just kind of a marker of the era. But when you look at the last, say, 50, 60 years, what was made, well, during King's time, nothing really in the film area, but lots of news coverage, of course. And then following his assassination in 1968, what occurred in terms of either documentary or narrative films about the life and legacy. Well, the first film that emerged in those immediate years of the aftermath of the assassination, in 1970 there was a featured documentary called MLK, A Filmed Record from Montgomery to Memphis. And those of you who are here in the Silver Spring, Washington, D.C. area and familiar with AFI Silver when we have our doors open, you may be very well acquainted with this film because we have presented this film as a free screening on MLK Day going back many years. I think we started in 2005 or around there, and we've presented it every year since. And we certainly will again once we're back in the theater and able to do so in person. As I mentioned, this film came out in 1970, and for many years, this was the only single comprehensive account of King's life and legacy from the Montgomery bus boycotts in the mid-50s through to the assassination in 1968. The film was produced by Eli Landau and Richard Kaplan, and it was directed by Sidney Lumet and Joseph Mankiewicz. The film takes an epic 3-hour-long approach to telling the entire story of King's public life from, again, Montgomery bus boycotts when he first burst onto the national scene through to when his life was tragically ended in 68. It features a wealth of archival news and documentary footage from that time period, as you would expect. And coming out in 1970, the film is very much, and I think understandably, a product of its time. It's very much in eulogy mode for the only recently slain civil rights leader. And it's a product of Hollywood. I mentioned the combination of Sidney Lumet and Joseph Mankiewicz directing the film. But it also features a number of Hollywood entertainment industry liberals, who many of whom were associated with the civil rights movement going back many years. And they appear here to introduce different chapters as the story moves through. So the the archival footage occasionally gives way to these sort of interstitial introductions by people like Harry Belafonte and Ruby Dee and Ben Gazzara and Charlton Heston, James Earl Jones, Burt Lancaster, Paul Newman and Joanne Woodward, Anthony Quinn, and Clarence Williams III. Maybe not a name that recognizable now, but back in 1970, audiences would have known him from the Mod Squad on television. And again, product of its time, 1970, some of the interstitial segments have a certain poetic oratorical approach as they set up the next chapter of the story and the archival footage. So it's a different approach to documentary filmmaking than what you would expect to have nowadays. For my part, I think that everything that's very 1970 about the approach makes it fascinating. Others may find that to be something that it has a dating, dates the film very much to its period in time. But again, very much a product of its time, very much something made in the immediate aftermath of the tragedy of the assassination. And for many, many years, decades even, it was the one definitive account. It was a long time before another approach was taken, either in narrative form or documentary form. But the film had a very strange history as well, even with the big names involved from Hollywood and the fact that it was Oscar nominated in its own time. It never had the benefit of a proper theatrical distribution. In fact, the film was originally conceived to be screened as a one-time only event. You know, maybe there was a certain belief that would get it seen by a lot of people all of a sudden. Maybe they thought that later on there would be a proper release, but it never actually materialized. And there were occasional screenings on TV regionally, but then it just kind of disappeared for many, many, many years. And it was kind of if you had to have seen it at the time, but it wasn't, you might recall it, but it wasn't something you could easily find during the 80s and 90s. And it's only somewhat recently become much easier to see. It was added to the Library of Congress's film registry in 1999, and it only received its first proper digital restoration and DVD release after that date. And again, we have been screening the film at AFI Silver since about 2005, and in our back then, we were showing it on a rather old 35 millimeter film print. It's now has the benefit of being available in a nice, crisp digital restoration. And it even has, really for the first time, proper distribution thanks to Kino Lorber. So this has contributed to the film at a much later point in time, becoming much, much easier to see. So a major entry on our list that we're going to be recounting for you of Martin Luther King documentaries and narratives has to start off with the 1970 film, King, a Filmed Record from Montgomery to Memphis.
And as you mentioned, Todd, this is now much easier to see. You can see it, I believe, on Amazon Prime. You can rent it to watch all 3 hours. And I sadly still need to catch up with it myself. Even though we've played it so many times at the theater, it's not one that I've actually seen, and that long list of names, is enough. But the fact that it's such a comprehensive and in the moment piece is of course adding to my interest and need to see it. So I'll be like maybe some of the listeners and watch it for the first time, maybe this weekend.
Well, it's a perfect time to do it.
And as you said, Todd, King, a Filmed Record is really expansive and comprehensive in looking at the life and work of Martin Luther King in documentary form. And this wasn't really something that was taken on in narrative work until about 8 years later, exactly 8 years later, with NBC's 1978 television miniseries King, which starred Paul Winfield as King and ended up with, I think, around 8 Emmy nominations, including a lead actor nomination. And then since 1978, there have, of course, been various narrative depictions of King that, rather than trying to represent his entire biography, focus on very specific chapters in his life and legacy. And among these is another television depiction that I want to mention, which goes pretty deep on King's early activism, and that's Clark Johnson's 2001 HBO movie, Boycott, which is inspired by Stuart Burns's book, Daybreak of Freedom, and covers the early days of the civil rights movement and King's role in it, and how he was kind of catapulted to the national stage at this very young age. The film begins in 1955 in Montgomery, Alabama, with the arrest of Rosa Parks and the response by local activists who band together to form the Montgomery Improvement Association and stage a boycott of the city buses to protest this segregation. And King at this time is a recently arrived preacher from Atlanta, and he's asked to lead the association in this citywide bus boycott. And what was going to be a day-long thing turned into 13 months. And as a result of the campaign, segregation on Montgomery's buses was ruled unconstitutional, and King really became a national figure. And so the film tracks how what started, as I mentioned, as this one-day protest turned into a standoff that lasted well over a year and turned into a national movement and gave rise to some of the greatest leaders of the civil rights movement, including, of course, at the film's center, Martin Luther King. So Boycott really covers a very short period of time between 1955 to 56, when King was really stepping up to become a leader. And I think it takes a story that maybe we think we all know pretty well and puts a very fresh and intimate spin on it. King is played by the excellent Jeffrey Wright, who is DC born and raised, by the way, if you didn't know that. In 2001, he had very recently starred in his first lead role in Julian Schnabel's 1996 biopic, Basquiat. And he's since been very prolific in film and TV, with roles in the most recent Bond films and The Hunger Games, in Boardwalk Empire, and of course, as the lead in HBO's Westworld. British actress Carmen Ejogo plays King's wife, Coretta Scott King. And Ejogo famously also played the role of his wife 13 years later in Ava DuVernay's Selma, which actually takes place around 10 years after the events of Boycott. So it's kind of perfect continuity there. Boycott won a Peabody Award for refusing to allow history to slip into the past. And it also received 3 nominations and 1 win at the NAACP Image Awards that year. And Jeffrey Wright really does bring King's humanity and vulnerability to the screen. This film reminds us that King was very young at this time. He was just 26, I think. He's a new father, a new pastor. And, you know, he was initially kind of reluctant to lead. And we see him kind of grow into that role over the course of this film. The film was directed by actor and director Clark Johnson, who had both starred in and directed episodes of NBC's Homicide: Life on the Streets, as well as episodes of The West Wing, Law and Order SVU. And then more recently, he went on to direct several episodes of The Wire and Homeland. And stylistically, he made some very interesting choices here. This isn't a staged biopic in any way. It was specifically shot, I've read in interviews with Johnson, to appeal to a younger generation of viewers, using a variety of styles, ranging from a kind of documentary-like aesthetic to a home video aesthetic, incorporating archival newsreel and 50s stock footage with also a soundtrack that feels kind of very much of the late 90s and early 2000s, mixing classic jazz performances with more contemporary pop, gospel, and R&B work. And his style really does have the effect of immersing you in the story and making it feel very intimate and immediate. So I think this is definitely one worth revisiting. And this year is its 20th anniversary because, yes, 2001 was somehow 20 years ago. So I think, yeah, now's the time, as good a time as any to check it out or to rewatch it. It is available on HBO Max at the moment. And of course, I'm definitely going to recommend a double feature with Ava DuVernay's Selma.
Well, as a big fan of Jeffrey Wright, I feel like I need to go back and see this film from, I can't believe it, 20 years ago. And I remember seeing him in Basquiat when it first came out, seeing it in the theater and being really, really impressed, and have just kind of followed his career all the way through since then. But I've never seen this particular film, and I think I need to. So another documentary film and another fairly recent film that continues in this vein of sort of isolated chapters of King's life and career that we would like to discuss in this segment is a documentary from 2013 called The March, directed by the British Ghanaian filmmaker John Akomfrah. And the film debuted on PBS in 2013, which at the time would have been 50th anniversary of the March on Washington from 1963, or in full, the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom, which is, of course, best remembered as being the event that included King's famous I Have a Dream speech delivered from the steps of the Lincoln Memorial in downtown Washington, D.C.
It was a day of miracles. It was the first time in a long time America had an opportunity to speak to the issues of poverty, speak to the issues of race, to see the American mosaic displayed this way was really quite stunning.
I thought, hot damn, there can be a beloved community. This is it. I mean, we have just done it. This country is going to move forward. We have wonderful spirit.
That speech, I have a dream, at that particular time, in that particular place, at the foot of the Lincoln Memorial, he summoned America's conscience. That's the legacy.
And the filmmaker here, John Akomfrah, really interesting filmmaker. Usually, most of his work has been in more of a sort of a artsy-oriented vein, but this is a relatively straightforward documentary and just a masterful job of telling the story of the lead up to all of the planning and logistics involved with the March on Washington, the way in which that there was an awareness that it was going to reach an even larger audience as a televised event, and the behind the scenes back and forth and rather intense negotiating and give and take that was going on with the Kennedy White House. And the film leans heavily on the excellent archival footage from the event, copious amounts of everything taking place that day, as you would expect a documentary like this to do so, with some very well-chosen interviewees reflecting on events now 50 years later. So we hear from Congressman John Lewis, Julian Bond, A. Philip Randolph, Clarence B. Jones, Andrew Young, in terms of people directly involved with the civil rights movement, and then also supporters from the entertainment world, including Harry Belafonte, Diane Carroll, Sidney Poitier, Joan Baez, and Peter Yarrow of Peter, Paul, and Mary fame. And the film is masterfully narrated by Denzel Washington. This documentary was aired on PBS a number of times in 2013, and we screened it a couple of years ago at AFI Silver. Unfortunately, it's not easy to find on streaming services right now, but it did come out on DVD, which you could either purchase or perhaps check your local library for. And I encourage everyone to seek it out. The March, it's excellent. Again, the filmmaker is John Akomfrah. I also highly recommend a documentary he did a few years ago called The Stuart Hall Project. But it's absolutely definitive on this particular chapter of King's career. And one more thing, in the UK, it went out as Martin Luther King and the March on Washington. So plug that in if you are in fact searching for it. And perhaps it's something that our listeners over there will have a little easier time finding than seems to be the case at the moment in the U.S.
Yeah, Todd, I agree. I think this is a really good documentary. It's too bad that it's not easy to see right now, especially because I think it really kind of sets the stage for the film I'm going to talk about here soon, Selma. It's kind of setting up where King was as a public figure and all those behind the scenes things leading up to the events that we see in the film Selma. And it also includes a lot of people who were featured in the Montgomery to Memphis documentary, the first one we talked about. Some of those same interviewees, almost 50 years later. So although Ava DuVernay had made a big splash in the art house world with Middle of Nowhere in 2012, Selma is really where she became a household name. In 2014, the film was nominated for the Best Picture Oscar, and it chronicled the life of Martin Luther King and his voting rights marches from Selma to Montgomery. So continuing in the vein of films that are specific time periods in King's life, this one is about those particular marches and the things that led right up to it. So the film itself opens up with the KKK orchestrated bombing at the 16th Street Baptist Church in Birmingham that killed 4 Black girls and injured 22 others in 1963. After this harrowing scene, we follow Dr. King as he talks with President Johnson about voting rights, and then moves on to Selma to meet with Southern Christian Leadership Conference activists, all while Hoover and the FBI are shown monitoring King's phones and trying to throw a wrench in his marriage, which of course we talked about earlier with MLK FBI, and which comes up again and again, as we know, in the MLK story. And after a confrontation with local authorities, he and other activists are arrested and put in jail. Again, this is when they're demonstrating in front of the courthouse, and they're accosted by local police and put in jail. But as the title would imply, the film really culminates in the 2 marches and the clash on the Edmund Pettus Bridge. So Selma really humanizes King and gets into his personal life and some of his personal shortcomings that we've already kind of touched upon. And DuVernay explicitly wanted to show this side of Dr. King, who is often depicted as a beacon of righteousness and figurehead for a movement, but rarely shown as a person. Along with this portrayal of him, there was also a bit of a controversy in her decision to keep the focus on Dr. King and the activists on the ground. Some people felt that this underplayed or even mischaracterized President Johnson's role in the civil rights movement and voting rights in particular. But DuVernay was adamant that she wanted to avoid making another film focused on white saviors in the Black civil rights movement. That was her thinking in making the film focus on that and not on Johnson. And chief among those who were upset about this was screenwriter Paul Webb, who through contractual agreements ended up with sole writing credit on the film. But in reality, his script was more of a first draft and was rewritten by DuVernay, hence the change in perspective that we got here. And it's hard to argue with the final results of what we see in Selma. And as I just mentioned a moment ago, the film really does manage to humanize Martin Luther King. And I think David Oyelowo here as King is really instrumental in doing this. He brings a wide emotional range to the character and really, again, humanizes Martin Luther King. He was nominated for both a Golden Globe and Independent Spirit Award and won the NAACP Image Award for this performance. And the rest of the cast is really right up there with him, giving us brilliant dynamic performances. As Abbie touched upon, Carmen Ejogo plays Coretta Scott King, reprising her role from over a decade prior. And in this role, she was nominated for an Independent Spirit Award as well, and also won an NAACP Image Award. Stephan James has a breakout turn here as young John Lewis, a major champion for voting rights, who we've talked about already, and who passed just recently back in July. And we see a dramatization here of what we saw footage of in Good Trouble, the documentary that came out recently, and we played in the virtual screening room about John Lewis, where he and other activists are indiscriminately beaten on the Edmund Pettus Bridge. Again, this is the climax of the film, leading to the successful march across the bridge that we see here fictionalized on screen. And James would go on to star in Barry Jenkins' If Beale Street Could Talk just a few years later in 2018. So he's doing great things in that film and in other projects. And there's also Oprah Winfrey here as Annie Lee Cooper, who had just come off a return to acting with her role in Lee Daniels' The Butler just the year before. And Tessa Thompson playing Diane Nash, and Lakeith Stanfield as Jimmy Lee Jackson. This was their first film together. And they would, of course, go on to star in Boots Riley's Sorry to Bother You in 2018. And rounding out this cavalcade of excellent actors is Andre Holland as Andrew Young, who we've mentioned again in biographies and a documentary that he showed up in a few of these films we talked about already. But here it's a fictionalized Andrew Young. And we have yet another Barry Jenkins connection, as Holland would go on to star in Moonlight just a couple of years later. And there are even more names to mention, but I can't go on forever here, on and on with all these names. It's a really great cast. You'll just have to revisit this great MLK film or check it out for the first time if somehow you haven't seen this fantastic, personal, and fairly unsanitized portrayal of Dr. King that rounds out his story and dramatizes a key moment in the civil rights movement as a whole and voting rights in particular.
So yeah, Ben, Selma, very worthwhile to revisit. I've certainly been thinking about it a bit recently following the passing of John Lewis a few months ago. And that documenting events in 1965 really sort of tees up segue to the next film that we want to discuss here, another documentary, because this film really kind of picks up where Selma leaves off in 1965. So this film is called King in the Wilderness, and it's directed by Peter Kuhnhart, and it was aired on HBO in 2018 after debuting at the Sundance Film Festival, where I first got to see it and was really impressed. And the film specifically focuses on the final years of King's life, following passage of the landmark Voting Rights Act in 1965. So if you're marking time by the films that we've talked about, that would be touched upon at the end of the film Selma, the same year. And then we have the events covered in King in the Wilderness in 1966, 67, and then tragically, King is assassinated in April of 68. So what happened with King's efforts in those final 2.5 years of his life and that space of time following passage of the Voting Rights Act, which of course was a huge goal of his overall plan and agenda and vision for advancing civil rights? Well, after an amazing decade of successes from the mid-50s to the mid-60s, culminating in the Voting Rights Act, in the next 2 years, King and his organization turned their attention to new efforts. And unfortunately, in this era, their efforts ran into some difficulties, the likes of which they had not yet encountered. So what's going on at this time? As we know, thanks to the documentary MLK FBI, Hoover's FBI surveillance of King was in full swing during these years. King's relationship with President Lyndon Johnson, which was always tense, went into an even tenser phase, especially after King publicly came out against the Vietnam War. And it's difficult for many of us now at this remove of time to understand what a hard dividing line this was for people at the time, whether they supported the war or questioned the war. But once King publicly took a position that he was anti-war and thought that the war was unjust and should end, it cost him. It cost him support that he previously enjoyed from many establishment figures in the media, in the business community, union leaders, people whose support was instrumental in advancing his cause and the overall civil rights effort. But this became a break, not only with Lyndon Johnson, not only further straining the difficult relationship with the president, but across many facets of life and areas where King had benefited from support. And it either dried up, or in the case of in the media, he got bad press, pushing back against his position from those who thought that the right thing to do was to continue to support the Vietnam War at that time. So that was a major setback for King's overall efforts. There was another undertaking at the time that unfortunately did not yield positive results, which is King and his organization opened a new office in Chicago. And this was seen as an outpost in the North, and they were looking to replicate the efforts and the successes that they had had in various Southern cities. But much to King and others' surprise at the time, they ran into obstacles everywhere they looked with their efforts in Chicago. King just encountered all sorts of problems with getting the organization established in Chicago and undertaking the work with poverty relief and educational improvements that they were seeking to do. Everything was subject to pushback from the political forces in place there. It just proved intractable. So a lot of time, money, and effort went into something that ultimately they had to retreat from. And then another area where King's efforts were suffering setbacks and where there was the beginnings of some crumbling in what had been a remarkably cohesive movement is that some of the members of King's organization and some of the younger members were starting to become impatient with King's unshakable belief in political nonviolence. So there's some dissension from within the ranks in terms of strategy and in terms of rhetoric. And most notoriously, this is around the time where Stokely Carmichael breaks from King and strikes out on his own, and what would become the new and much younger oriented Black Power movement of the time. And we do in fact see Carmichael and King together on camera here, with Carmichael rhetorically baiting King, who I would say demonstrates impressive patience in that moment. And once again, like so many documentaries that we've been discussing here, this film combines archival footage with interview subjects, just as you would expect. But there are two significant differences here. Again, these events are exclusively from 66, 67, 68. And we see here some of the only color footage documenting King that exists. And that may sound like a small thing, but it does make you realize how much of what we see in our mind's eye that we're accustomed to seeing when we look back at footage of King is in black and white. And some of the color footage here is tremendous, and it just has a certain fresh feel to it. So it's a very archival, geeky thing, but I think it does have an aesthetic quality that lends something unique to this film. And then another aspect, something that's unique about this film, among the interviewees here, crucially, are significantly more of the women from the movement than we have typically seen in other documentaries on the subject, including many of the documentaries that we have been discussing here and singing the praises of, that unfortunately, for some reason, did not include as many women who were, in fact, very much part of these efforts. Among the people who are featured prominently for interviews in those documentaries. So we hear in King in the Wilderness quite extensively from Marion Wright Edelman and Zernona Clayton, both of whom are outstanding interview subjects and lend a lot to our understanding and discussing this chapter, this rather painful chapter in King's life story. And when I say painful, I mean painful because of the setbacks to what the effort was, and then, of course, ultimately the tragedy of the assassination in 68. And in addition to Edelman and Clayton, there are interviews with other SCLC figures, including Andrew Young, once again, always excellent in interview, C.T. Vivian, Bernard Lafayette, Jesse Jackson, and Jesse Jackson's very good discussing Chicago aspects of the story as well. Harry Belafonte once again, and Joan Baez once again. This film is still relatively new. Like I said, it only came out in 2018. And I just thought that it just crucially filled in a part of the life and the story and the legacy and the work that had not received as much attention, understandably, as some of the other big chapters, many of which we've talked about here with the March on Washington, with Montgomery bus boycott, which received their own individual attention in some of these excellent docs we've talked about. So this one, even though it's painful because it's all of these setbacks being recounted, I just found that it added so much to round out the story, both for King and the organization as a whole, and had a lot in there that I thought was important just to understand that. Yes, it's a movement, it's an organization, but it's people, and there's a lot of people politics going on here as well. Really a tremendous documentary. I highly, highly recommend seeking out King in the Wilderness.
Well, I think if you wanted to do a mini MLK marathon watching session over this long weekend, hopefully we've given you a few ideas and gone over a pretty extensive list of films that cover individual chapters in King's life and legacy, and also the full expansive view. So yeah, hopefully you'll be able to check out some of these. And then, of course, we started off by talking about the most recent entry into the canon of documentaries about Dr. King, and that's MLK FBI. And so we'll just leave you with some audio from the trailer.
Violence is self-defeating. He who lives by the sword will perish by the sword.
You know, when you construct a man as a great man, there's nothing almost more satisfying than also seeing him as the opposite.
When the National Archive puts government documents up on the web, one has to confront them.
Tapes from the hotel rooms, FBI reports, those are pieces of information that we shouldn't have. The FBI was most alarmed about King because of his success.
He realized how sick this country was. We were trying to reveal the truth about segregation.
J. Edgar Hoover is famous for saying that he feared the rise of a black messiah.
The FBI says it's clear Martin Luther King Jr. is the most dangerous Negro in America, and we have to use every resource at our disposal to destroy him.
All right, so that wraps it up for this week's edition of Silver Streams. Thank you all for listening. Please stay safe, stay healthy, and we hope that you see something that you love this week.
Bye, everyone. Stay safe and have a great long weekend.
Bye, everyone. Thanks for tuning in to Silver Streams this week, and we'll be back again next week when we hope you check it out.
A reminder to our listeners, you can find everything currently available in our virtual screening room on our website at AFI.KING/silver. And a portion of the proceeds from screening these titles at home goes to support AFI Silver Theater. If you have any feedback or questions, you can email us at silverinfo@afi.com.
You can also get in touch with us or follow us on Facebook, Instagram, and YouTube at AFI Silver Theatre, and on Twitter at AFI Silver.
Music for this week's episode was provided by Blue Dot Sessions. To find more of their work, visit their website at sessions.blue.